reverse Roe v. Wade, the next big decision to face the Supreme Court. Martin Luther King's niece has become a key pro-life activist. She'll tell us about a big push she is making next week. We now continue with Shahid Buttar and Rich Lowry. Rich, let me just, you know this happened. It was reported in the Washington Post last weekend when President Bush said that the public's decision to re-elect him was a ratification of his approach, and there's no reason to hold any administration officials accountable for mistakes or misjudgments. Now, I find that to be a remarkable statement, and I can understand why some Americans will want to protest that kind of an attitude, that lack of accountability. And I think if a Democrat had said that, there would be conservatives out in force protesting that kind of a statement.
Well, Alan, what the president meant by that statement, I think pretty clearly, is that the American people got to decide whether his Iraq policy was better than the alternative being offered by John Kerry on the other side. And the fact is, John Kerry really didn't offer any alternative because he didn't have one, except for perhaps holding some international summits. And the big thing that's going on here, I think, Alan, that we've seen particularly over the last couple of days, is the idealism that was one of the finest traditions, foreign policy traditions in the Democratic Party that ran right through FDR, through Truman, through Kennedy, men who believed profoundly in the goodness of American power and our mission to spread liberty abroad. That idealism has now shifted
you're
to the right
and
to President Bush. No, this is exactly
what you're really not dealing with here is this. What statement went beyond? You spun it very well. But they don't want to be accountable for mistakes and misjudgments in pre-war planning. Please let me get the question out. Or managing the violent aftermath. And to say what? We shouldn't continue to ask questions in a war that continues to go badly even after the election?
Sure, you can ask questions. That's fine. But one, you should have a better alternative if you actually want the American people to trust you in power. And John Kerry and the liberals did not offer one last year. Oh, it's absolutely true, except for international summits. And two, asking questions was not what was going on with some of those protesters yesterday, Alan. They were throwing rocks at people. They were throwing snowballs. They were cursing at people who just showed up to enjoy a parade. And that's wrong, and it's something you should condemn.
Shahid, the fact is that there was a plan the Democrats had. I don't know if they did a good enough job getting it out there. But clearly, where the situations and parties reversed, we'd hear great protests from conservatives if Democrats were this arrogant.
You're absolutely right. And just to frame a couple of things here. First, I don't want to posit that John Kerry is an acceptable alternative to most of the people that were there. John Kerry only had a platform because of the anybody but Bush tide and the idea that we could rally around someone who was relatively centrist. But I would agree that John Kerry really didn't have a vision, and the reason is because he was Bush light. We're not looking for piecemeal solutions. We want transformative change, and we're willing to
demand it. Did you not vote for Kerry, Shahid?
I did vote for Kerry.
You did? Okay. Let me ask you this. I want a yes or no answer, and I'm not going to accept any other one, because it's really a simple question. By and
what is your question?
I want to know, by and large, do you, Shahid Buttar, do you, by and large, view America as a good country, yes or no?
Absolutely. Our values are so profoundly good. Freedom and democracy and liberty and rights. And George Bush talks those words a lot, but his actions don't support them.
Oh, look,
we have systematically undermined them
he's brought
all around the world.
Rich,
he's brought freedom and liberty to Afghanistan and to Iraq. These are two countries.
You think Iraq is
about
free?
50
We're going to have elections
it's on
in a
its
week.
way to freedom. And the fact is, your foreign policy vision would left people in both those countries, or at least in Iraq, sunk in tyranny.
What would you have to say about Saudi Arabia? At the very best, you're under-inclusive, which is to say that your arguments would apply at least as well as Saudi Arabia, but they happen to be the president's friends. So even though the dictatorship there is no less reprehensible and, in fact, responsible for 9/11, they continue to be this administration's best friends.
Mr. Buttar.
Well,
I find that a bit
minute.
That's a rank exaggeration.
Mr. Buttar, I want to ask you this question. You know, if you had your way, the mass graves of Saddam would still be open. Wait a minute. Right. If you had your way, the rape rooms would still be open.
So instead we have the mass graves of George
You claim
Bush.
to be a great champion of human rights, but if you had your way, the torture chambers would be open. How do you justify that support of corruption and immorality?
We have torture chambers. They have American flags over them.
Oh, you're silly. That's
Guantanamo Bay. Abu Ghraib.
Let me ask
I've seen pictures. You can ignore facts as much as you like, but the facts remain true, regardless of whether you choose to ignore them.
But there are not 300,000 skulls and skeletons being pulled out of the ground. Rich Lowry, I want to ask you this. When we look at these protesters, Didn't they really get their marching orders from Ted Kennedy, who whipped their minds into a frenzy and said we concocted a war for political gain, or Dennis Kucinich, who said George Bush is targeting civilians for assassination,
or perhaps ourselves, who said that we're whipping.
Al Gore, who said that George Bush betrayed his country? Aren't they really just repeating the leaders of the Democratic Party?
Sure. I mean, Sean, there was a time when Democrats rejoiced when we freed countries abroad. And the fact is, this anti-war left, apparently their vision of peace and justice would be in Iraq with Saddam Hussein, a vicious tyrant, still in power. And that's a real shame that the left has totally lost
Rich,
its
focus
soul.
on this.
Let me
Rich, focus on this point.
I'm a lawyer, and so we like to talk about
Shahid,
rigor
it's not
and
your turn.
rules.
Hang on a second.
Okay.
But Rich, focus on this point. If people like Howard Dean advance the theory the president knew about 9/11, if a former vice president screams that George Bush betrayed his country, if a congressman says we're targeting civilians for assassination, no wonder we see people that believe Democrats in power when they tell these lies. Isn't that true?
Well, Sean, I mean, what's happened is some of the poison of this real extreme anti-war left has seeped into the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and that's why the American public does not trust the Democrats
Rich,
on
you're
national
painting the left with
security.
an incredibly broad brush here that is totally not
have some
representing your
liberals
leaders.
realizing
Totally
that.
too broad a brush. Look, we thank you both very much for being with us tonight.
Thanks, Alan.
Coming up,
Thank
what
you
would
very
Martin
much.
Luther King think about the modern pro-life movement? His niece has some strong feelings about it, and she will be here to explain later. Justice spills to the streets as a murder suspect's family meets the victim's family outside the courthouse.